Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of Fort Benning's shooting range, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The morning Georgia sun cast long shadows across the training grounds where young Rangers were preparing for their advanced marksmanship qualification. At 52, Marcus looked every bit the retired veteran he was. Graying hair, deep lines around his eyes, and a slight limp that told stories of battles fought in distant lands. The younger soldiers barely acknowledged his presence. To them, he was just another civilian contractor hired to maintain the range equipment. They didn't know about his 25 years of service, his 3 tours in Afghanistan, or the classified missions that had earned him decorations he could never publicly display. Marcus preferred it that way. The quiet life suited him after decades of chaos and violence. Sergeant Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old Ranger with a reputation for his shooting skills, was holding court near the firing line. His voice carried across the range as he regaled his squad with stories of his longest confirmed kill, a Taliban fighter at 200 meters during his deployment in Kandahar. The other Rangers listened with the kind of respect reserved for proven warriors. Marcus had heard this story before. Morrison told it often, each time adding a few more meters to the distance or a few more dramatic details about the wind conditions. Not that Marcus minded. Soldiers had been embellishing their war stories since the beginning of time. It was part of the culture, part of how they processed the reality of what they'd experienced. What bothered Marcus wasn't the storytelling. It was the way Morrison and his crew treated him. They saw him as just another aging maintenance worker, someone who probably never held anything more dangerous than a wrench. When they spoke to him at all, it was with the casual dismissiveness that young warriors often showed to those they perceived as civilians. Morrison noticed Marcus watching and decided to have some fun. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You ever fire one of these rifles, or do you just clean them?" He gestured toward the M24 sniper rifle he'd been preparing for the day's training exercise. A few of the Rangers chuckled. Marcus simply nodded and took another sip of his cold coffee. "I've handled a few guns in my time," he said quietly. This prompted more laughter. Morrison walked over. His chest puffed out with the confidence of youth and recent combat experience. "Oh yeah, what's the longest shot you ever made?" 50 yards at a deer?" Marcus looked at the young sergeant for a long moment. There was no malice in Morrison's voice, just the casual arrogance of someone who believed he knew everything about the world around him. Marcus had been like that once, decades ago, before the military had taught him humility through hard experience. "I don't really keep track," Marcus replied, which was true in a way. The shot that had made him legendary in certain military circles wasn't one he talked about. It wasn't one he could talk about even now, years after his retirement. Morrison shook his head and turned back to his squad. "That's what I thought. Stick to fixing things, Pops. Leave the real shooting to the professionals." The other Rangers erupted in laughter, and Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago when a group of Marines had questioned his abilities before a joint operation in the mountains of Afghanistan. That day, he'd proven himself in ways that still haunted his dreams. As the morning progressed, the Rangers began their qualification course. Marcus watched from his position near the equipment shed, noting their techniques, their breathing patterns, their stance adjustments. They were good, very good, in fact. Morrison, despite his attitude, was genuinely skilled with a rifle. His groupings were tight, his follow-through consistent, but they were shooting at static targets at predictable distances in perfect weather conditions. Marcus had learned long ago that real-world shooting was nothing like range qualification. In combat, you dealt with wind that shifted without warning, targets that moved unpredictably, and the kind of pressure that could turn an expert marksman into a shaking amateur in seconds. During the lunch break, Marcus overheard Morrison talking to his squad leader about the upcoming advanced sniper course. The young sergeant was confident he'd place first, as he had in every marksmanship competition since joining the Rangers. His natural ability combined with his combat experience made him the unit's unofficial shooting champion. "I'm telling you," Sergeant Morrison said to his squad leader, "there's nobody in this unit who can outshoot me. Hell, there's probably nobody on this entire base who can match what I did in Afghanistan." Marcus continued organizing equipment in the shed, but his ears picked up every word. The young man's confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. He was genuinely talented. But talent without wisdom was dangerous, especially in the military. Marcus had seen too many promising soldiers get themselves or their teammates killed because they confused skill with invincibility. As the afternoon training session began, Marcus noticed something interesting. The wind had picked up, and the temperature was dropping as clouds moved across the sky. The Rangers were struggling with the changing conditions, their shots drifting off target as they failed to compensate for the shifting air currents. Morrison was getting frustrated. His usual precision was suffering, and his shots were consistently pulling to the left. He adjusted his scope twice, but the problem wasn't with his equipment. It was with his reading of the environmental conditions. Marcus watched quietly, remembering his own early struggles with wind calculation. It had taken him years to develop the instinctive understanding of how weather affected bullet trajectory. These Rangers were learning the hard way that range shooting and field shooting were entirely different skills. When the day's training ended, Morrison approached Marcus again. This time his demeanor was slightly less cocky. "Hey, you noticed anything wrong with that rifle I was using?" The scope seemed off. Marcus looked at the young sergeant with interest. At least he was smart enough to ask questions when things weren't working. "Rifle's fine," Marcus said simply. "Wind's been gusting from the northwest all afternoon. About 8 to 12 miles per hour, shifting every few minutes." Morrison frowned. "I accounted for the wind." "You accounted for the wind you felt on your face," Marcus corrected gently. "But wind's different at different distances. What you feel at the firing line isn't necessarily what's happening downrange." For the first time, Morrison looked at Marcus with something approaching respect. "You seem to know a lot about shooting for a maintenance guy." Marcus just shrugged and walked away, leaving the young ranger to wonder exactly who he'd been dismissing all these months. The following week brought an unusual visitor to Fort Benning. Colonel James Harrison arrived without fanfare, driving his own vehicle instead of the typical military convoy that accompanied high-ranking officers. Marcus recognized him immediately. They'd served together in Afghanistan, though their paths had taken very different directions after the war. Harrison found Marcus in the equipment shed, carefully cleaning rifle scopes with the methodical precision that had made him legendary among special operations units. The colonel waited until Marcus finished with the delicate lens before speaking. "Hello, Marcus. You're looking well." Marcus set down the scope and turned to face his old friend. "Colonel, what brings you to Georgia?" Harrison glanced around the shed, taking in the perfectly organized equipment and the meticulous care with which everything was maintained. "We need to talk, privately." They walked to a quiet corner of the base, away from the training areas where Rangers were conducting their daily exercises. Harrison's expression was serious, the kind of look Marcus had learned to recognize during their deployment together. "There's a situation developing," Harrison began. "Intelligence suggests a high-value target will be in a specific location next month. The problem is the distance. We're talking about a shot that's well beyond normal sniper range." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "How far beyond normal?" 8,000 meters. Maybe more. The number hung in the air between them. 8,000 meters was an extraordinary distance for any sniper shot, far beyond what most marksmen would even attempt. At that range, factors like the Earth's rotation became significant variables in bullet trajectory calculations. "You're talking about the kind of shot that maybe 5 people in the world could make," Marcus said quietly. 3 people, Harrison corrected, "and one of them is standing right here." Marcus understood immediately. His reputation in certain military circles was based on a single shot he'd made in Afghanistan, a 7,200-meter elimination that had prevented a terrorist attack on a coalition base. It was classified so far beyond normal levels that even most generals didn't know the details. "That was different," Marcus protested. "I had perfect conditions, unlimited time to set up, and the best equipment the military could provide. Plus, I was 20 years younger." "The equipment part we can handle," Harrison said. "As for the age factor, your hands are still steady and your mind is sharper than most people half your age. I've been watching you work." Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd thought those days were behind him, that his war was over. But some things never truly ended for men like him. "What's the timeline?" he asked, already knowing he was going to say yes. 3 weeks. We need to get you back into shape and up to speed on the latest equipment." As they talked through the preliminary details, neither man noticed Sergeant Morrison approaching the equipment shed. The young ranger had returned to retrieve a cleaning kit he'd forgotten. But he stopped when he saw the colonel talking intently with Marcus. Morrison couldn't hear their conversation, but something about their body language suggested this wasn't a casual chat between a maintenance worker and a visiting officer. The colonel was showing Marcus the kind of respect typically reserved for senior NCOs or fellow officers. When Harrison left, Morrison approached Marcus with curiosity. That seemed like a pretty serious conversation for someone who just fixes equipment. Marcus was putting away the rifle scopes, his movements automatic and precise. Sometimes fixing things requires more expertise than people realize. Right, Morrison said, still skeptical. Look, I wanted to apologize for last week. I was out of line with some of the things I said. This got Marcus's attention. Morrison wasn't the type to apologize easily, which meant something had prompted this change in attitude. I've been thinking about what you said about wind patterns, Morrison continued. I did some research, talked to some of the senior instructors. Turns out you were right about the downrange conditions being different from what we feel at the firing line. Live and learn, Marcus said simply. The thing is, most maintenance guys wouldn't know details like that. Hell, most soldiers wouldn't know details like that. So either you're the most well-read equipment tech in the Army, or there's more to your story than you're letting on. Marcus looked at the young sergeant for a long moment. Morrison was sharper than he'd initially given him credit for. That was good. Intelligence could be taught, but natural awareness was a gift. Everyone's got a story, Marcus said finally. Most of them aren't as interesting as people think. Over the next few days, Morrison found himself paying closer attention to Marcus's work routine. The older man's knowledge of weapons systems was encyclopedic, and his care in handling equipment went far beyond what any contractor would normally demonstrate. More importantly, Marcus moved with the kind of situational awareness that only came from years of combat experience. During a particularly challenging training exercise, Morrison watched Marcus observe the ranger's shooting techniques. The older man would occasionally nod approvingly or frown slightly at certain habits, as if he were evaluating performance rather than simply maintaining equipment. You know, Morrison said during a break, for someone who claims he doesn't keep track of his shooting, you sure seem to know a lot about marksmanship fundamentals. Marcus paused in his work. Observation is part of any job. You see enough people do something, you start to understand what works and what doesn't. Maybe, Morrison replied. But the way you watched Jackson adjust his scope yesterday, that wasn't casual observation. That was the kind of analysis I'd expect from a sniper instructor. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several trucks carrying specialized equipment. Marcus watched with interest as technicians began unloading cases marked with classifications, far above anything normally seen at a training facility. Morrison noticed the equipment too, and his curiosity piqued when he saw Marcus nod to one of the technicians as if they knew each other. This was becoming more mysterious by the day. That evening, Morrison decided to do some research. He had friends in various units, people who might know something about a contractor named Marcus Thompson, who seemed to know far more about military operations than his job description suggested. What he found surprised him. Marcus Thompson had indeed served in the military, but the details of his service record were heavily redacted. Most of his deployments were classified, and his decorations were listed in a way that suggested significant combat experience without providing specific details. Morrison's friend in military intelligence was able to provide a few more clues. Thompson's name comes up in some circles, he said during a secure phone call. Nothing I can talk about over the phone, but let's just say he's not just any random contractor. Word is he was something special back in the day. The next morning, Morrison approached Marcus with new respect but also new questions. I know this might be out of line, but I did some checking. Your military record is mostly classified. Marcus continued his work without looking up. A lot of records from that era are classified. Different time, different wars. Come on, Marcus. Whatever you did in the military, it was more than standard infantry work. The way you handle weapons, the way you read shooting conditions, even the way you move, that's not training you get in a regular unit. Marcus finally looked up, meeting Morrison's eyes directly. What exactly are you asking me? I'm asking if you're going to keep pretending you're just a maintenance guy, or if you're going to level with me about who you really are. The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He could continue the charade, maintain his cover and his quiet retirement, or he could acknowledge what Morrison had already figured out, that his past was far more complex than anyone at Fort Benning realized. Marcus set down his tools and looked directly at Morrison. The young sergeant had earned honesty through persistence and observation, qualities that Marcus respected in any soldier. "All right," Marcus said quietly, "but this conversation doesn't leave this shed." Morrison nodded eagerly, sensing he was about to learn something significant. "I was a sniper. 25 years, multiple deployments, specialized units that most people never heard of. When I retired, I wanted a quiet life, so I took this job. Figured I'd stay around weapons and soldiers without the responsibility of life and death decisions." "What kind of specialized units?" Morrison pressed. Marcus hesitated. Even in retirement, operational security was ingrained in his thinking. The kind that handled situations regular units couldn't. Long-range reconnaissance, high-value target elimination, operations that required unusual precision. Morrison's eyes widened. "How long range are we talking about?" "Long enough," Marcus replied cryptically. "The record I set is still classified, and it's probably going to stay that way for a long time." Before Morrison could ask more questions, Colonel Harrison appeared at the shed entrance. His timing was clearly intentional. He'd been monitoring the conversation. "Sergeant Morrison," Harrison said formally, "I need to speak with Mr. Thompson privately." Morrison snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." He started to leave, then turned back. "Marcus, thank you for being straight with me." After Morrison left, Harrison walked deeper into the shed. "That young man is sharp. How much did you tell him?" "Enough to satisfy his curiosity without compromising anything important," Marcus replied. "He's not going to stop digging, though. He's got good instincts." "That's actually why I'm here," Harrison said. "The mission parameters have changed. The target location has been moved to an even more challenging position. We're now looking at a distance that exceeds your Afghanistan record." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "How much longer?" "Preliminary measurements suggest around 8,700 meters. Possibly more depending on the final position." The number was staggering. At that distance, a bullet would be in flight for more than 10 seconds. Environmental factors that were minor considerations at normal sniper ranges became major variables. The curve of the Earth itself would affect the trajectory. "That's not just a long shot," Marcus said slowly. "That's a shot that pushes the absolute limits of what's physically possible, which is why we need the best," Harrison replied. "There's something else. The window of opportunity is narrow, maybe 30 seconds. No time for ranging shots or adjustments. One shot, one chance." Marcus understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just about marksmanship skill. It was about making calculations and adjustments that would have to be perfect the first time. Any mistake would mean mission failure and potentially catastrophic consequences. "What's the target situation?" Marcus asked. Harrison pulled out a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "High-value terrorist leader, confirmed location, surrounded by civilians. Clean shot required to prevent collateral damage. The distance is actually an advantage. It keeps our shooter far from enemy forces and reduces the risk of detection." Marcus studied the imagery carefully. The terrain was challenging, with multiple elevation changes and wind patterns that would be difficult to predict. The shooting position would have to be established in hostile territory, with extraction routes planned for multiple contingencies. "I'll need a spotter," Marcus said. "Someone good enough to handle the calculations and environmental reading at this distance." "We were hoping you'd say that," Harrison replied. "We'd like you to train someone already familiar with the area and capable of learning advanced techniques quickly." "You want me to train Morrison?" Marcus said. It wasn't a question. His records show exceptional mathematical ability and superior marksmanship skills. More importantly, he's been asking the right questions about your background. That suggests the kind of intellectual curiosity we need for this type of operation. Marcus considered the proposal. Training a spotter was always a delicate process, requiring trust and communication that could only be developed through intensive practice. Morrison had the raw talent, but he also had the arrogance that could be dangerous in high-stakes situations. He'd need to know everything, Marcus warned. The physics, the environmental factors, the ballistic calculations that most snipers never learn. and he'd need to understand that at these distances, ego gets people killed. Can you teach him? Marcus thought about Morrison's attitude over the past few weeks. The young sergeant had shown the ability to learn and adapt, and more importantly, he demonstrated respect for knowledge when he encountered it. I can try. But Harrison, if this goes wrong, if he can't handle the pressure or makes a mistake at the critical moment, then the mission fails, and a lot of people die. Harrison finished. I understand the stakes, Marcus. That's why we're asking you to come out of retirement. Over the next few days, Marcus began observing Morrison more carefully during training exercises. The young sergeant's shooting was technically proficient, but Marcus noted several habits that would need to be corrected for extreme long-range work. Morrison's breathing technique was good for normal distances but would need refinement. His trigger control was excellent, but his scope adjustments showed he relied too heavily on equipment rather than understanding the underlying physics. Most importantly, Marcus needed to know if Morrison could handle the mental pressure of a mission where failure wasn't just personal embarrassment but potentially strategic disaster. The opportunity to test Morrison's character came during an advanced marksmanship exercise. The Rangers were attempting shots at 800 meters in challenging wind conditions, and several were struggling with consistency. Morrison was growing frustrated as his shots scattered across the target instead of maintaining his usual tight groupings. Marcus watched as the young sergeant adjusted his scope repeatedly, trying to force a mechanical solution to what was actually an environmental problem. Sergeant Morrison, Marcus called out during a break in the exercise. Morrison approached, clearly annoyed with his performance. These conditions are impossible. The wind keeps shifting, and the mirage is making it hard to get a clear sight picture. Walk with me, Marcus said, leading Morrison to a position where they could observe the range without being overheard by other soldiers. What do you see when you look downrange? Marcus asked. Morrison squinted through his scope. Target's heat mirage, some grass moving in the wind. Look again. Don't focus on the target. Focus on everything between you and the target. This time Morrison took longer, scanning methodically. The grass is moving differently in different areas. The mirage is stronger on the left side of the range. Better. Now what does that tell you about wind patterns? Morrison considered the question. The wind isn't consistent across the entire distance. It's stronger on the left, and it's probably moving in slightly different directions at different points. Exactly. At extreme distances, you're not dealing with one wind condition. You're dealing with multiple wind zones, each affecting your bullet's trajectory differently. Your scope adjustments can't compensate for that. Only your understanding of the environment can. Morrison nodded slowly, beginning to grasp concepts that most snipers never encountered. How do you learn to read all those variables? Practice, patience, and a willingness to accept that some shots are impossible no matter how good you are, Marcus replied. The hardest lesson for any marksman is knowing when not to take the shot. That afternoon, Morrison's performance improved dramatically. Instead of fighting the conditions, he began working with them, timing his shots for brief moments when the wind patterns aligned. His groupings tightened and his confidence returned. But it was a different kind of confidence based on understanding rather than just natural ability. Marcus watched with approval. Morrison was learning to think like a precision marksman, rather than just shooting like one. It was the first step toward the kind of expertise required for the mission Harrison had described. 2 weeks later, Colonel Harrison returned to Fort Benning with authorization for Morrison to receive specialized training. The young sergeant was told only that he'd been selected for an advanced marksmanship program, nothing about the specific mission or the extraordinary distances involved. Marcus began Morrison's education in a classroom rather than on the range. The walls were covered with ballistic charts, weather pattern diagrams, and mathematical formulas that looked more like advanced physics than military training. Forget everything you think you know about long-range shooting, Marcus began. At the distances we're going to discuss, bullets don't behave the way you learned in basic sniper school. Morrison sat forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Marcus pointed to a chart showing bullet trajectory over extreme distances. At normal, sniper ranges, say 800 to 1200 meters, you're dealing with basic ballistics, gravity, wind resistance, some minor environmental factors. But when you start pushing beyond 2,000 meters, other forces come into play. Such as the Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth actually affects bullet flight at extreme distances. A bullet flying north will drift slightly east, one flying south will drift west. Most snipers never encounter distances where this matters, but it becomes critical beyond 1/500 meters. Morrison's eyes widened. The Earth's rotation affects bullet trajectory? That's just the beginning. At really extreme distances, air density changes with altitude become significant. Temperature variations along the bullet's path affect velocity. Even barometric pressure changes can throw off calculations. Over the following days, Marcus introduced Morrison to concepts that challenged everything the young sergeant thought he knew about precision shooting. They spent hours calculating trajectory tables for different environmental conditions, learning to read weather patterns that most people would never notice. The key, Marcus explained during one session, is understanding that you're not just aiming at a target. You're predicting where a small piece of metal will be after traveling through constantly changing conditions for 8 to 10 seconds. 10 seconds? Morrison asked. How far are we talking about shooting? Marcus hesitated. Morrison didn't have security clearance for the specific mission details, but he needed to understand the scale of what they were preparing for. Let's just say we're discussing theoretical distances that push the absolute limits of rifle accuracy, Marcus said carefully. Distances where everything has to be perfect: equipment, calculations, environmental reading, and execution. The practical training began on a specialized range that had been quietly constructed in a remote section of Fort Benning. The targets were placed at progressively longer distances, starting at 1/500 meters and extending outward in 500-meter increments. Morrison's first attempts at 2,000 meters were humbling. Shots that would have been perfect at normal distances missed the target entirely. The young sergeant quickly realized that his previous success had been built on natural talent rather than true understanding of long-range ballistics. This is impossible, Morrison said after missing a 2,500-meter target by several meters. How can anyone make accurate shots at these distances? It's not impossible, Marcus replied calmly, but it requires a different mindset. You're used to making instinctive adjustments based on what feels right. At extreme ranges, intuition isn't enough. Everything has to be calculated precisely. Marcus demonstrated by taking a shot at the same target. He spent several minutes reading wind conditions, checking atmospheric pressure, and making precise adjustments to his scope. When he finally fired, the bullet struck within inches of the center. How did you do that? Morrison asked, amazed. Practice, patience, and respect for the physics involved, Marcus replied. But also acceptance that even with perfect preparation, some environmental factors are beyond our control. That shot could have missed if the wind had shifted at the wrong moment. As Morrison's training progressed, Marcus began sharing more details about the mental aspects of extreme-range shooting. The psychological pressure of knowing that a single shot could determine mission success or failure. The need to remain calm while calculating complex variables under stress. The hardest part isn't the technical knowledge, Marcus explained. It's maintaining perfect mental discipline when everything depends on your performance. At extreme ranges, there's no margin for error, no opportunity for follow-up shots. Morrison was beginning to understand why Marcus had been selected for whatever mission they were preparing for. The level of expertise required went far beyond normal military training. This was a combination of science, artistry, and nerves that few people could master. During one particularly challenging session, Morrison managed to hit a target at 3,000 meters. The success was exhilarating, but Marcus's reaction was measured. Good shot, Marcus said. But remember, this is under perfect conditions with unlimited time to prepare. Real operations don't provide those luxuries. To prove his point, Marcus set up a scenario where Morrison had to make the same shot with a time limit and simulated pressure. The young sergeant's performance immediately declined, his calculations rushed and his breathing pattern disrupted by artificial stress. This is why psychological preparation is as important as technical training, Marcus explained. Your knowledge is useless if you can't access it under pressure. They began incorporating stress training into their sessions. Morrison learned to make rapid but accurate calculations, to read environmental conditions quickly, and to maintain steady breathing even when facing artificial time constraints. Colonel Harrison visited regularly to monitor progress, though he never discussed the specific mission timeline with Morrison. Marcus could tell from Harrison's expression that whatever operation they were preparing for was approaching rapidly. "How much longer do we have?" Marcus asked during one of Harrison's visits. 2 weeks, maybe less," Harrison replied quietly. "The target's schedule has been confirmed and the window of opportunity is narrowing." Marcus nodded grimly. 2 weeks? Wasn't enough time to complete Morrison's training to the level he'd prefer, but it would have to be sufficient. The young sergeant had shown remarkable progress, mastering concepts that typically took months to understand. That evening, Marcus found Morrison on the range, practicing calculations by moonlight. The dedication impressed him, but it also highlighted the enormous responsibility they were both accepting. "Sergeant," Marcus said, approaching quietly. Morrison looked up from his charts. "I can't get the Coriolis calculations right for eastward shots at maximum range. The numbers don't feel right." "Trust the mathematics," Marcus advised. "At extreme distances, what feels right is usually wrong. Your instincts were trained for normal shooting distances." They worked through the calculations together, Marcus guiding Morrison through the complex formulas that accounted for Earth's rotation at different latitudes and shooting directions. "Marcus," Morrison said suddenly, "this isn't just training, is it? This is preparation for a real mission." Marcus looked at the young sergeant for a long moment. Morrison had earned the right to know what he was being prepared for, even if the specific details remained classified. "Yes," Marcus said simply, "and if we succeed, a lot of people will live. If we fail." "I understand," Morrison replied. "When do we deploy?" The question hung in the night air, carrying the weight of decisions that would soon determine the outcome of an operation years in the planning. Marcus realized that his quiet retirement was officially over, and that Morrison's life was about to change in ways the young sergeant couldn't yet imagine. The deployment came sooner than expected. 48 hours after Morrison's question, both men were aboard a military transport heading toward a classified location in the Middle East. Morrison had been given minimal briefing, enough to understand his role as spotter but not enough to compromise operational security if captured. Marcus stared out the aircraft window at the desert landscape below. 15 years had passed since his last operational deployment, but the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread felt unchanged. Beside him, Morrison reviewed ballistic charts with the intensity of a student cramming for final exams. "Remember," Marcus said quietly, "all the calculations in the world won't help if we can't establish the correct shooting position. Terrain selection is critical at these distances." Morrison nodded, still focused on his charts. The young sergeant had absorbed technical knowledge at an impressive rate, but Marcus worried about how he'd perform under real operational stress. Training scenarios could simulate pressure, but they couldn't replicate the knowledge that enemy forces were actively hunting you while you prepared for a shot that could change the course of a military operation. Upon arrival at the forward operating base, they were briefed by intelligence officers who provided final details about the target and mission parameters. The terrorist leader they were tasked with eliminating had been tracked to a compound in mountainous terrain that offered limited approach routes but excellent long-range shooting positions. The target will be visible for approximately 30 seconds. During a scheduled meeting, the intelligence officer explained, "Weather forecasts suggest moderate winds from the northwest. Clear visibility with temperatures ranging from 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit." Marcus studied the satellite imagery carefully. The shooting position was located on a ridge approximately 700 meters from the target compound. The elevation difference would add complexity to their calculations, but it also provided concealment and multiple extraction routes. "What's the backup plan if weather conditions change?" Marcus asked. "There is no backup plan," Colonel Harrison replied bluntly. "This is our only confirmed opportunity to locate this target in an isolated position. If we miss this chance, he disappears back into populated areas where a strike would be impossible." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. Thousands of lives potentially hung in the balance of a single shot at a distance that pushed the very limits of rifle accuracy. They moved to the shooting position under cover of darkness, traveling in modified vehicles that could navigate the rough mountain terrain. Morrison rode silently, checking and rechecking his equipment while mentally reviewing the environmental factors they'd studied. The ridge provided an excellent vantage point with clear sight lines to the target area. Marcus immediately began establishing their position, setting up the specialized rifle system that had been flown in specifically for this mission. The weapon was a custom-built platform designed for extreme-range shots, with a barrel over 4 feet long and optics that resembled small telescopes more than traditional rifle scopes. Morrison established his observation post and began taking environmental readings. Wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. Every variable that could affect bullet trajectory needed to be measured and calculated precisely. Initial wind reading shows 8 miles per hour from the northwest, Morrison reported. Temperature is 87 degrees, humidity at 34%. Marcus began his pre-shot routine, a methodical process he'd developed over decades of precision shooting. First, he verified the rifle's zero at a known distance using a temporary target. Then he began calculating trajectory adjustments for the 700-meter shot, factoring in all the environmental variables Morrison was providing. The mathematics were staggering. At that distance, the bullet would drop over 800 feet due to gravity. Wind would push it several feet off course. The Coriolis effect would cause additional drift. Even small errors in calculation could result in missing the target by dozens of meters. Target compound is showing activity, Morrison reported, observing through high-powered optics. Multiple vehicles arriving but no visual on the primary target yet. Marcus continued his calculations, double-checking every number. At this distance, there would be no opportunity for a ranging shot or quick correction. The first bullet had to be perfect. Hours passed as they waited for the target to appear. The sun climbed higher, changing temperature and creating heat mirage that made observation more difficult. Marcus monitored these changing conditions constantly, updating his calculations as environmental factors shifted. "I've got movement at the compound," Morrison said suddenly. "Multiple individuals exiting vehicles. Stand by for target identification." Marcus positioned himself behind the rifle, his breathing slow and controlled. Through the massive scope, he could barely make out human figures moving around the distant compound. At 8,700 meters, even with the most advanced optics available, individual identification was extremely challenging. "Positive identification on primary target," Morrison confirmed after several tense minutes. "Subject matching known photographs has exited the main building and is moving toward the meeting area." Marcus made final adjustments to his scope, factoring in the most recent environmental readings. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring a small correction to his aim point. At this distance, a 1-degree error in wind calculation could result in missing the target by several meters. "Wind update," Morrison called softly. "Now showing 9 miles per hour, direction unchanged. Mirage patterns suggest consistent air density along the flight path." Through his scope, Marcus could see the tiny figure of their target moving across the compound. The man appeared as little more than a dark speck against the lighter background of the buildings, but Marcus's years of experience allowed him to track the movement patterns and predict where the target would be when the bullet arrived. "Target entering the meeting zone," Morrison reported. "Window of opportunity beginning now." Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate to minimize any movement that could affect accuracy. At this distance, even the pulse of blood through his veins could influence shot placement. He began the final phase of his shooting sequence, a mental countdown that synchronized his physical state with the mathematical precision required for success. The crosshairs settled on a point several feet ahead of where the target currently stood. At 8,700 meters, the bullet would be in flight for over 10 seconds, requiring Marcus to aim at where the target would be rather than where he currently was. 15 seconds remaining in window, Morrison warned quietly. Marcus's finger moved to the trigger, applying the gradual pressure that would release the shot. His breathing stopped, his body becoming as motionless as humanly possible. The world narrowed to the tiny image in his scope and the mathematical certainty of his calculations. 5 seconds, Morrison whispered. Marcus fired. The rifle's massive muzzle blast echoed across the mountainous terrain, but Marcus remained motionless behind the scope, tracking the target through his optics. At this distance, it would take several seconds for the bullet to reach its destination. Morrison counted silently, timing the bullet's flight based on their ballistic calculations. 10 seconds felt like an eternity as they waited to see the result of months of preparation and a lifetime of expertise. Impact, Morrison called suddenly. Target down. Mission successful. Through his scope, Marcus could see the aftermath of his shot. The target had collapsed, and the other figures in the compound were moving frantically, seeking cover and trying to understand what had happened. At 700 meters, they would have no idea where the shot had originated. Confirm elimination, Marcus said quietly, maintaining visual contact with the target area. Confirmed, Morrison replied after several moments of observation. Target is not moving. Secondary personnel are evacuating the area rapidly. Marcus finally lifted his head from the scope, his body beginning to relax after the intense concentration required for the shot. The mission was complete, but they still needed to extract safely from their position before enemy forces could organize a search. They began packing their equipment with the same methodical precision they'd used in preparation. Every piece of gear had to be secured and carried out. Nothing could be left behind that might provide intelligence to enemy forces. Marcus, Morrison said as they prepared to move. I've never seen anything like that. How did you know the shot would work? I didn't know, Marcus replied honestly. At that distance, with all the variables involved, there's always uncertainty. What I knew was that the calculations were correct and the preparation was thorough. Sometimes that has to be enough. As they moved away from the shooting position, Morrison reflected on what he'd witnessed. The shot Marcus had just made would likely never be officially recorded or publicly acknowledged. It would remain classified, known only to a small group of military personnel who understood its significance. Will anyone else ever know what happened here today? Morrison asked. Marcus shouldered his pack and started down the mountain trail. The people who needed to be stopped won't be able to hurt anyone else. That's what matters. The extraction proceeded without incident, but Marcus knew that word of the extraordinary shot would eventually spread through certain military circles. Despite official secrecy, news of exceptional marksmanship always found a way to circulate among those who understood its significance. Back at Fort Benning weeks later, Marcus returned to his quiet routine of equipment maintenance. Morrison, now carrying the knowledge of what he'd witnessed, treated the older man with a respect that bordered on reverence. The young sergeant had learned that true expertise often wore humble clothing, and that the most extraordinary capabilities sometimes belonged to the most unassuming people. 3 months after their return from the classified mission, life at Fort Benning had settled back into its normal rhythm. Marcus continued his work maintaining equipment, but now the younger Rangers treated him with a different kind of respect. Word had somehow spread that the quiet contractor was more than he appeared, though the specific details remained unknown to most. Morrison had been promoted to staff sergeant and assigned to train new recruits in advanced marksmanship techniques. He never spoke directly about the mission they'd completed together, but his teaching methods had been transformed by the experience. Instead of focusing solely on natural talent and basic techniques, he emphasized the scientific principles underlying long-range accuracy. During one training session, a cocky young ranger named Bradley was struggling with shots at 600 meters. His frustration was growing as environmental conditions challenged his usual shooting approach. "This is stupid," Bradley complained loudly. "Real combat doesn't involve shooting at these distances anyway. When would anyone ever need to make a shot beyond 800 meters? Morrison glanced toward the equipment shed where Marcus was working, then back at the struggling soldier. "You'd be surprised," Morrison said quietly. "Sometimes the impossible shot is the only option available." "Come on, Sergeant," Bradley persisted. "What's the longest confirmed sniper kill in history? Maybe 400 meters? Nobody's making shots beyond that range in real combat." Several other Rangers gathered around, interested in the discussion. Morrison found himself in an awkward position. He knew the truth about extreme range shooting capabilities, but he couldn't reveal classified information. "The longest shots don't always make it into the history books," Morrison said carefully. "Some operations remain classified for operational security reasons." "That's convenient," Bradley said with a smirk. "Every time someone claims impossible shooting performance, it's always classified or unverifiable." Marcus had been listening from the equipment shed, and he could see Morrison struggling with how to respond. The young staff sergeant was trying to teach important lessons about marksmanship without violating security protocols. Walking over to the group, Marcus set down his tools and looked at Bradley. "Son, what's your best confirmed hit?" Bradley puffed up with pride. 850 meters, Taliban fighter, perfect conditions. Clean kill with one shot. That's good shooting, Marcus acknowledged genuinely. But let me ask you something. If your buddy's life depended on you making a shot at 2,500 meters, would you take it? Of course, Bradley replied without hesitation. What about 2,000 meters? Bradley hesitated slightly. If I had to, yeah. 3,000 meters? Now Bradley looked uncertain. That's getting pretty far. I mean, I'd try, but what about 8,700 meters? The group fell silent. That distance was so far beyond normal shooting ranges that it seemed almost theoretical. That's impossible, Bradley said finally. Nobody could make a shot at that distance. The bullet would be in the air for like 10 seconds. You couldn't even see the target clearly enough to aim. Marcus nodded slowly. You're right that it would be extremely difficult. Bullet flight time would be over 10 seconds. Environmental factors would be critical. Target acquisition would be challenging. So you agree it's impossible, Bradley said triumphantly. I agree it's extremely difficult, Marcus corrected. But impossible is a strong word. With the right equipment, perfect environmental conditions, extensive preparation, and exceptional skill, such a shot might be theoretically possible. Morrison watched this exchange with fascination. Marcus was providing education without revealing classified information, teaching the young Rangers to think beyond their current limitations. But who would even try a shot like that? Bradley asked. It would be pure luck if it worked. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, Marcus replied. A shooter attempting such a distance would need to understand ballistics at a level most people never encounter. Wind patterns, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, even the rotation of the Earth become factors at extreme ranges. The Rangers listened with growing interest as Marcus described the theoretical challenges of ultra-long-range shooting. He spoke about mathematical calculations, environmental reading, and equipment capabilities without ever claiming personal experience. The mental pressure would be enormous, Marcus continued, knowing that everything depends on a single shot, with no opportunity for correction or follow-up. Most people couldn't handle that kind of responsibility. Bradley was beginning to look less confident. Have you ever shot at distances like that? Marcus smiled slightly. I've done some long-range shooting in my time. Nothing as extreme as we're discussing, but enough to understand how challenging it becomes as distances increase. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed a change in the Rangers' training attitudes. His theoretical discussion had sparked curiosity about extreme-range marksmanship, and several soldiers began studying advanced ballistics in their spare time. Morrison incorporated more scientific education into his instruction, and the overall quality of marksmanship improved throughout the unit. Colonel Harrison visited Fort Benning regularly, and Marcus could tell from their brief conversations that the success of their classified mission had generated significant interest in military circles. Plans were being developed for additional extreme-range capabilities, and Marcus's expertise was increasingly valued. During one of Harrison's visits, he approached Marcus privately. There's been discussion about establishing a specialized training program for extreme-range marksmanship. We'd like you to consider heading up the instruction. Marcus thought about the offer carefully. That would mean coming back on active duty. Not necessarily. We could structure it as an advanced contractor position with significant autonomy. You'd be training the next generation of precision marksmen for situations that hopefully will never arise. The proposition was tempting. Marcus had discovered that he missed the intellectual challenge of advanced marksmanship, and his recent mission had proven that his skills remained sharp despite years of retirement. I'd want Morrison as my assistant instructor, Marcus said finally. He's got the right combination of technical knowledge and teaching ability. Already considered, Harrison replied. His promotion and training assignment were partly designed to prepare him for such a role. 6 months later, Fort Benning quietly established the Advanced Precision Marksmanship Program. Marcus Thompson was listed as the senior civilian instructor, though his background remained officially classified. Staff Sergeant Morrison served as military liaison and assistant instructor. The program attracted elite shooters from across the military, soldiers who had already proven exceptional marksmanship abilities and were selected for training in techniques that pushed the boundaries of rifle accuracy. During the program's first graduation ceremony, Bradley, who had become one of Marcus's most dedicated students, approached his instructor with genuine respect. "I want to apologize for that day when I said long-range shooting was impossible," Bradley said. "I understand now that I was talking about things I didn't understand." Marcus nodded approvingly. "The first step toward real expertise is recognizing how much you don't know. You've made excellent progress. Can I ask you something?" Bradley said quietly. "That day when you described shooting at 8,700 meters, you weren't just talking theoretically, were you?" Marcus looked at the young soldier for a long moment. Bradley had earned the right to understand that extraordinary capabilities existed, even if the specific details remained classified. "Sometimes," Marcus said carefully, "the impossible shot is the only option available." Bradley nodded slowly, understanding that he'd received as much confirmation as operational security would allow. He walked away with a new appreciation for the quiet contractor who had transformed his understanding of what human skill and determination could accomplish. That evening, Marcus stood at the edge of the same firing range where he'd first encountered Morrison's arrogance months earlier. The young staff sergeant approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Any regrets about coming out of retirement?" Morrison asked. Marcus accepted the coffee and looked out over the range where a new generation of soldiers was learning skills they hoped they'd never need to use in combat. "None," Marcus replied. "Sometimes the most important victories are the ones nobody ever knows about." The 2 men stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Fort Benning, both understanding that their quiet work might someday prevent conflicts that would otherwise cost thousands of lives. The impossible shot had spoken louder than any words could, proving that dedication, expertise, and humility remained the most powerful weapons in any soldier's arsenal.